Greetings, sir.
Yes, evening. I'm just waiting for more persons to come before we start.
No problem, sir.
Evening, guys. Oh, hold on. All right, who were the persons who were supposed to have presented? Jerome, did you present when we had class?
No, sir. I never get a chance to present last class. I think this week I did my week to present.
Remember, I'm not talking about the tutorial question now. I'm talking about when we were looking at the regional agreements.
I missed that class, sir.
Right, because some persons look at different. I think the person who Javar, which one did you get? I think you got Caribbean single market and economy.
Yes, sir, I did.
All right, so go ahead.
Give me a sec, sir.
And while he's looking for that, Rashid, which regional agreement you were supposed to look at? Rashid, are you there? Rashid Tucker?
Yes, sir.
Which one, which regional agreement did you present?
No, sir. No presentation was happening, sir.
The one we did the last time. So I know, for example, that Javar got Caribbean single market and economy.
Sir, me and Kenya would have two African trade agreement.
No, I gave you a different one. Everybody got a different one from the last time.
Well, I didn't get that one, sir.
Okay. All right. So let's allow Javar to present. Go ahead, Javar.
One more second, sir. All right, so good evening, everyone. And this evening, myself, Javar Williams, will be presenting on Caribbean single market and the economy. So, all right, so a brief history. So the information I gathered on history is the Caribbean Free Trade Commerce Area, CARIFTA, which served the narrow purpose of abolishing tariffs and other obstacles to intra-regional trade in products, was established in 1968, marking the beginning of the CSME. Through the signing of the Treaty of Chaguaramas, if I'm pronouncing that right, which included measures to establish a sort of common market in the region, the integration process was deepened in 1973. By 2002, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas had established new and unrestricted rights for Caribbean citizens to establish businesses anywhere in their region, called for the removal of existing barriers, and created a single market space where not only goods but also services, capital, technology, and skilled workers should freely circulate. All right, so there are 15 member of states within the CSME, the Caribbean Single Market Economy. So we have Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Montserrat, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Anguilla, if I'm pronouncing that right, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos Islands. All right, so the purpose of the CSME, seeks to implement provisions for the removal of trade and professional restrictions. These provisions facilitate the right to establish businesses, to provide regional services, the free movement of capital, and the coordination of economic policies. Also, the CSME is designed to represent a single economic space within which goods, people, services, and capital can move freely, and as such, it will require the harmonization and coordination of social, economic, and trade policies among the participating member states, which I previously mentioned. So the benefits of the CSME is that, first one, it expanded potential for trade and production of goods and services in a combined market of over 14 million consumers. Second, production of competitive goods with higher standards and costs. Third, enhanced services offered by businesses and people, additional investment opportunities being created. Fourth, the expansion of travel opportunities with increasing chances for citizens to work and study in CARICOM nations of their choice. Next, last one, the creation of more work possibilities and higher living standards. So the achievement that I managed to gather so far was areas of achievement within the CSME included legal and institutional measures and mechanisms to support the free movement of goods, services, skills, and the cross-border establishment of businesses. And that will be the end of my presentation. I hope that you at least managed to get a grasp of what was being said, and yeah, thanks for listening.
All right, so thank you very much, Javar, for giving us a very informative presentation, giving us the historical background, looking at the purpose, the benefits, and some of the achievements of CSME. I would ask you, though, do you know what is the current state of the Caribbean single market and economy? What's the current state? Does it exist, or? Javar?
With that, sir, I did look it up with you know. Can't
All right,
remember.
so that's something you need to look at. And I was wondering too, something I didn't hear in the presentation. Can you list some of the goods and services that are traded among member states?
Okay. Well,
if you
we
don't
have
know,
like,
if you don't know, just say don't know and don't make up anything.
all right, so I was just about to make up, but all right, so I'll just say I don't know, right?
Right. It's always better to say you don't know than to make up things, okay? Yeah.
All right, sir.
All right. So, and of course, as I said, this was just a class activity. I'm sure if it were a graded assignment, you'd have gone a little deeper in terms of looking at the information. All right. So I think Rashid said that you looked at the African Union, one of the regional trade agreements in Africa. If that's what I'm remembering you saying earlier. Am I correct, Rashid? Okay, it seems as if Rashid is not there. It can't be that people are logging into the class and the class is already small and you're not there. Remember, there's a final exam, there's a mid-semester, there's a research paper, there's a tutorial. It's a lot of reading and stuff, and the information is new to you. So I'm hoping persons are actually, when you come to class, you're actually physically there and you're also doing some work outside of the class. All right. Two things or a few things before I begin. Today I shared in the WhatsApp group a link, which is kind of a free textbook, a free textbook on international business. I hope people saw that. International. So let me just share screen and show you what I'm talking about. I don't want necessarily to share all my screen, but let's look at it. So this is the link that I shared in the WhatsApp group. So if you can click on almost every and anything and get information. All right, and remember too that information is on Canvas. Let me just go back to Canvas. I'm not sure how many of you have been logging into Canvas, but there's information there as well on the international business. So please ensure that don't think that I'm going to come and teach you everything, okay? And they are properly labeled and stuff like that. So this is actually where we are international. This is what I'm going to teach, the international trade theories. I'm going to upload the lecture as well. So please ensure that you are actually paying attention to what is on Canvas. So I've shared a link. I think probably I might put the link as a part of Canvas as well, although really you should have permission to do that. However, I've decided to just share it in the WhatsApp group. So in addition to the many supporting materials that are on Canvas, that's just another resource. So please ensure you're paying attention, you're reading. I'm going to help you next week in terms of how to write an academic paper, how to structure it. I know today for presentation purposes today, let me just double check. Can't remember the young man's name who's presenting or who should present. I've already cautioned persons about missing their presentations. So I expect, this is what I'm looking for. I think I'm looking for ECC courses, international business, summer 2022. And I just need to find the tutorial paper. Lectures, I don't think it would be here. Although it is on, that was the in class. So where's my tutorial paper? It's on Canvas nonetheless, so I can just download it from Canvas. So that, right here it is. So today our presentation is by Jerome. I'm hoping Jerome is here. Oh yes, Jerome is here. All right, so we are going to do the presentation in the latter part of the course. The latter part of the lecture, not the course. All right, so I'm going to do my part first. Yes.
They say I go tell it you tell me I go on first, and then in the last half of the class before I present.
Yeah, I'm going to teach somewhat. I'm not going to teach all the theories today because it's a lot. It would be too
Sir,
much.
could I give me
class.
a time? You could have give me a time frame on it, like the last half an hour, last.
Why? You're in the class. You're supposed to be here. Why do you need that time?
No, man. No, what I mean, so I can mentally prepare myself. Say, all right. So when it reaches,
if you want to go now, I can. If you want to go now, you can actually go now.
Yeah, because I don't want the things stem out too far, sir. Because remember, say after you tell them everything in their mind, they get drained and their focus gone other places. So I don't know. Just give me a small run off fight because.
Okay, all right.
Go really ahead, sir. Me leave it there on the laptop, sir. But I have my phone. I just want to share like a video and just run through and just. You just tell me if I'm on the right track.
All right. So go ahead then.
All right. So how much people there? Just me, you. All right. So night, everybody. Jerome Parnell here. So the question I got was I'll pull up the question. I'm not able to share screen as you can see because I'm up on my phone. So I'm just going to read what I have or try my best to explain everything to you as best as possible. So ready, let me start. I'm going to try to keep the time limit as short as possible and spicy. Because I don't know, so I have to tell you where I have to tell you same way. All right. So let's go. So the question was, using 3 examples, discuss the evolution of international trade since the beginning of the Christian era into the 21st century, right? So it's basically say week 5, July 11 to 15. So the presenter is Jerome Parnell, as you all know. All right, so we'll dive right into it. How much share? I have a video on the next one more share, but I want everybody to just kind of look into it. Just give me a second. So 1 second, I'm just connect it up. All right. So anybody have any idea of what international trade is furthermore? While me get this thing together. Anybody? Anybody? Hello? Come in, man. I just 3 over there now. Along with Sir, or 4 over there along with Sir. Just give me a small answer while I prepare the lesson for the realest way.
Well, good evening, sir.
Yes, sir.
International trade would have to do with like exchange of like goods and capital and maybe service between countries.
All right, so the video ready. It's a 6-minute video. I don't know if I can play all right. We just want to get certain concept across. All right, so just listen to the audio, okay?
Every day, a network of ships, trucks, and planes move massive quantities of goods around the
Supply
world.
chain.
Your car might come from South Korea
Mhm.
and your t-shirt from Bangladesh. All countries export, sell products and services abroad, and import, buy goods and services from foreign trading partners. These goods are manufactured items or agricultural commodities, services.
Don't you hear that? So I don't know what industries you guys working in, but if you really look around for the day-to-day movements and everything what you do, and all of that, you realize that we play a vital role in everything. So everything interconnected, and yeah. So I'm not going on again.
Part of trade refer to
I
all
forgot come out of the
intangible
knife.
goods, such as advertising and telecommunication. But the trade network is more complex than sellers and buyers. The system of worldwide trade is an intricate web in which lengthy supply chains allow products to be sourced, assembled, packaged, and sold in different parts of the world. The materials for your phone or shoes or the tuna fish you had for lunch might have been produced in one country, processed in another country, assembled in a third
So
country,
go back to the supply
and packaged
chain
somewhere else, all
and
before getting to your
globalization.
local store. How does this make sense? Why can't countries just make their own phones, shoes, or tuna fish and
Why?
provide more jobs and business domestically? Before the 19th century, most...
All right, so question, who did answer me? It's with the Ram truck. Javar? Javar still here?
Yeah, man.
All right, so why you think countries have a trade on an international scale?
Well, Mr. Obes, I can put this. Well, I think they might have a trade on an international scale because probably, I guess they won't have like certain resources to like make and do certain things. So I wonder if I put this right, but I guess so.
All right, I'm
Probably
gonna show you why. A comparative
yeah.
advantage it lead back to, right? I'm gonna show you something. Is a vital piece of equipment, right? I don't want to stray too much, but I just want to show the levels to the things that deeper than what we are look upon it. Right? Watch out now. Anybody know what it is?
Not sure. Like
You
an
know what it
engine.
is? It's a coming like a ship engine. It is a ship engine used
Yeah.
as a generator. Right? So anytime power cut at any big place or any certain organization where production have to keep on a move, this are the engine with chip in. You understand what I say? So comparative advantage. This is Jamaica Medina people. You understand what I say? So comparative advantage is the thing. So one place good on making certain equipment, them just develop it and show the world, say, yo, this can work. All right. So listen to the rest of the presentation.
Prioritizing self-sufficiency in a system called mercantilism. Mercantilism aimed to maximize exports, minimize imports, and increase the country's supply of gold. This system led to strict tariffs or taxes on imports as a way to not only discourage bringing in goods from abroad, but profit off it. Mercantilism created barriers to international trade. Countries needed to produce as much as possible on their own, including things they weren't able to make efficiently.
Yeah, you're
In the
right.
late 18th century, so-called classical economists refuted these long-held beliefs, championing the
Men
idea
like
that
David
societies should trade
Ricardo,
with one another to be
Adam Smith,
successful
you know, and
because
them link up and start
market
talk to
advantage.
each other and
The
share
idea that
information.
when countries focus
So
on
me not
making
even
things
go no more into the video. So basically now, so it has stemmed from globalization. What is globalization? Globalization is a process driven by international trade. This helps countries to come together to trade. Globalization is the integration of business internationally through commanding a variety of customers worldwide. You understand? So we make customers come together as one through one thing, the internet. You understand? And link up and say, hey, I need this equipment, you know, how me get it here? So, all right, moving on. Globalization is a form of e-commerce which has a lot to do with economic development and financial well-being around the world. Globalization is the process in which people, ideas, and goods throughout an international scene are merged. Encourage interaction. It encourages interaction and integration between the world, cultures, governments, and economies. All right, June. All right, so we'll dive into some of the examples of things that happen, even though the video displayed a lot of that, but I look for some points specifically. All right, so the Christian era, this was the earlier time. They put it as AD, and that was from the foundation of the city in Rome. You understand? So like, you don't know you have before Christ and the period between that, after that, right? So that period had to do with the exchange of knowledge more than the exchange of goods. So what that means, say, where you know, me need to know. You understand when I say information have to flow? Anyways, let's move on. So knowledge that is not shared is useless, basically. Information has to flow in order for things and systems to work properly. In order for there to be order, people must understand each other. For there to be a proper movement of information throughout the world. Knowledge is nothing unless it is shared. That was something that also led to the concept of comparative advantage, where the sharing of information between nations led to the development of concept for growth and development. From this came a very vital moment in history where the Portuguese and the Spanish discovered the Americas during the early 15th centuries through the 18th centuries, right? And then I have a next point now when we lead to scientific discoveries and the industrialization era and the introduction of democracy, right? Brought light to the nations. This era stemmed from the 19th centuries there on to about the 21st to the early 20th century, right? This era saw light to discovery and making of equipment simple as the typewriter in the 19th centuries, right? That was like the first computer that was brought to the world. Correct me if I'm wrong, people, right? So that was like, so through the knowledge that was shared between the early segment, right? That now led to scientists now developing concepts and sharing concepts, right? Between each other, which is the main thing in international trade. So without international trade and comparative advantage and sharing of knowledge and all of that, basically everywhere would be left out. And I think that is one of the things that is even pushing the thing between Russia and Ukraine. All right, sir. So that was basically a small presentation from me, Mr. Parnell. Sir, I give the rest of the class. All right. All
Okay.
right. Thanks everybody.
Okay. Any questions or comments? For example, people, do you think he answered the question? It says, using 3 to 5 examples, discuss the evolution of international trade since the beginning of the Christian era into the 21st century. Question, comments from persons. Javar, do you think he answered the question? Rashid, Alray, I'm not sure how much of it Gabriel heard.
For me, sir, well, yes, yes, it was a good presentation. It was interesting. Yes, I do believe that he answered the question. And it was very informative. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anybody else wants to comment? Okay, I take that as a no. All right. So I'll begin with let me begin with the positives. So there was, I like the fact that you linked the discussion, the question to your area of study, the whole notion of supply chain and how that becomes a very important area in international trade. I like the fact that you were able to somewhat contextualize globalization, defining it, for example, as the integration of businesses. And then you kind of went into some of the time periods, talking about knowledge sharing as part of the foundation, and that and because of scientific discovery and to some extent industrialization, knowledge sharing led to those things in terms of scientific discovery and industrialization. So that part was really good. My recommendations in terms of improvement is that the presentation needs to be better organized. So for example, remember in my previous class, you need to tell us specifically what time periods are you looking at. So if you say you're using 3 to 5 examples, what specific 3 to 5 examples are you using? And you're looking at the evolution of international trade since the beginning of the Christian era. So you did mention before Christ and you didn't say after Christ, but that's part of what you were talking about. But what was happening at the time? Was it that they were trading, or I think you mentioned that they were just exchanging knowledge? But I still think there was some amount of trade, because if you're talking about the evolution of international trade, then is it that they were not doing any international trade, they were only doing domestic trade? Or do you bring the discussion to the point of mercantilism, where international trade, that's really the first theory that helps us, or the first ideology that helps us to understand international trade? During the first part of, if there was ever a time for international trade, in other words, trade began as nation state, it was very domestic, companies, people were trading between and among themselves within their own borders. And then what you should have done is to help us to understand what then led to them going outside of their country and what specific time periods were you talking about. The other thing too that I wasn't clear about is at what point did you bring the discussion into the 21st century? I think I heard the 20th century, but not the 21st century. So remember, the 20th century is different from the 21st century.
I understand. I say. So
right.
I leave out, like my left out the most valuable part, which would be the 21st century, where I deal with the new era things, the development of technology. So now people are walking with phone in their pocket compared to when phone they just there at home.
Mm-hmm.
So
and even the globalization of, if you want to say, even telephone, and how that in and of itself reduce the cost of phones and allow people all over the world to have it. So you see what I mean?
Understood.
They could have said 21st century, we're going to look at the mercantilist era, and then we're going to look at the era when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
You say, okay, those are the 3 periods I'm going to look at. You see what I mean? So just kind of put it together
brush it up some more, and forward back again. But I have the concept right, but I just the delivery. The
Just the
delivery wasn't
delivery.
100%. All right,
So
sir.
what I'll
Understood.
do in the next class, I
Yeah.
will help everybody to kind of put in terms for the written
Brush up
part
them
now.
presentation.
Right,
Okay,
especially
sir.
for the written part, because the written part now, it
Yeah.
has to be an academic paper. It can't be just, you just start.
Yeah, it can't be just verbal, and I've got to
Exactly.
put them words there to the paper now.
Exactly.
All right, sir.
So yeah. So but I forgot to mention that I love the example that you gave of the machine that is there, because, and you mentioned also comparative advantage. But just remember that comparative advantage was like a third theory. It was one of the third. So it was mercantilism first, then it was absolute advantage, then it was comparative advantage. All right. So, and even that in and of itself would kind of help us. You could have even said that you're going to look at the evolution of international trade through the evolution of international trade theories. Because mercantilism kind of helps us to understand the origin or the origins of international trade. You see what I mean? Then, of course, after that, no, you can talk about, well, I'm going to teach you that today in terms of absolute advantage, and then comparative advantage in terms of when countries now started to specialize. All right. So a very good start. There were some good points in the presentation, but just to tighten things up a little bit. So remember now, for everybody, ensure that you have your thesis. Tell us exactly what are you looking at. So give us this sense of the roadmap. So for my presentation today, I'm looking at 3 specific areas.
Yes,
Right,
give them the objectives.
Right. So I'm going to look at this, that, and that. And I am really arguing that this. That's how you kind of do it. And
Yes,
of course,
sir.
remember I said when it's oral, no, you can bring in the audio, visual, you use different things. So don't just play a video for 6 minutes. I would prefer if you keep the videos to like less than 2 minutes, and they must be necessary. And also don't just use audio visual, kind of vary the content. So if you notice what I do, I have written words. Sometimes I play a song, sometimes I play an audio. I try to vary the way I present the information. So you want to also do that when you're doing your presentation. All right?
Yes, sir. Understood.
Right.
A good thing I go before you start teaching class, because you would get no time to explain all of this to me. Thanks for that, sir.
No problems. So next week, no, we will have Javar and Kemar. So 2 presenters next week, Javar and Kemar. Remember, you're not working together. You are so not working together. It's an individual presentation. All presentations are done on Wednesdays. The only reason it never happened on Wednesday of last Wednesday of this week is because I was extremely exhausted, and my doctor said to me, once I feel overwhelmed, I should rest, because it's something that has affected my health before. So all right, so I will now get into the lecture. Are there any questions or anything before I go any further?
Sir,
yes.
When you say we not work together as an individual,
I'm talking for the presentation for next week tutorial. So Javar is doing his own presentation, and Kemar is doing his own presentation for number 3. So we have 2 different presenters.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're not working as a peer in terms of presenting one paper. So in other words, one presentation from Javar might look at GATT, Javar might look at GATT, and then the other person might look at the World Bank, or the other person might look at the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. You determine which ones you want to look at. All right. So I don't think I need to stop sharing screen. I'll just bring up my PowerPoint. I was kind of putting it all together. No, stop sharing, because I don't think I'm sharing all the screen. Yeah, let's turn on audio. So today, now we're going to formally look at, today we're going to formally look at international trade theories. I've somewhat introduced you to some of the trade theories, but now we're going to formally look at the trade theories, and then to some extent give you some sort of class activity to see where you are and how you understand and how you respond to the trade theories. One thing that I forgot to do, give me 1 sec, is, and I usually include it in it. All right, so give me 1 sec, guys. But the first thing, let me ask you this: how would you define the term theory. What would be your definition of the term theory? How would you define the term theory?
Theory would be like some written concepts from some great people, sir. I don't know.
Yeah, so one we can say theory.
Theory would be like a structure towards a specific thing. You understand? So if there's a theory to most things in life, no, that's it.
Right. Yes. Anybody else?
Look at more beef on it.
Well, you are correct in terms of how you're looking at theory. Usually I don't know how I forgot to include that in it, but it's very, because usually once I'm teaching anything theoretical, I always start out with theory. So theory really, a theory really explains how something is done or why something is done. So it's very important for you to, oh yes, I need to put that in this, that a theory is either prescriptive or descriptive. I don't know how I forgot to put this part in my lecture. This is I'm actually developing my lecture on the spot. It's so unprofessional. Why don't you, I said save. Okay, slideshow, one slide. So a theory is a general idea or concept about how something is done or why something is done. So it really describes how something is done or why something is done, or it prescribes how something is done or why something should be done. Does that make sense? Do we understand that my explanation in terms of a theory?
Yes, sir.
So theories, you can think of a theory as well, to some extent, as an idea or systems of ideas intended to explain. You can think about it as a kind of supposition, but just remember that theories are informed by empirical evidence or by research. And so theories are built out of phenomena, meaning that research was done and there was a kind of established way of looking at things or describing things. So if you think, for example, about mercantilism, to some extent, mercantilism is a descriptive theory. It describes what happened at a moment in time. And you can, and then when you think about a prescriptive theory, you can think about, for example, economic liberalization or neoliberalism or liberalism, whichever term you want to use, where they are saying these are the things that you should do if you want to participate in international trade, and how, for example, that kind of theory led to, or the overarching theory being either descriptive, being prescriptive, led to the formation of international organizations such as the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. So I want for you to think about theories that particular way. So in the theories that we will look at, it is important for you to think of them either as descriptive or prescriptive and have specific examples to support your assertions. So one of the first theory, or if not the first theory that really helps us to conceptualize or understand international trade, especially the origins of international trade, is mercantilism. And we is a theory that really emphasizes self-sufficiency through a favorable balance of trade. And we're going to get into a big discussion about balance of trade. And again, I keep going back to former President Donald Trump, because he becomes a kind of pariah at the international level. But when you dig a little deeper, you see that some of his concerns and some of his sentiments actually make sense. And we're going to explore what we mean by balance of trade. So mercantilist policies focus on the accumulation of wealth and resources while maintaining a positive trade balance with other countries. In other words, when we're talking about trade balance, we're talking about a country exporting more than importing. And that was part of what was being argued or pushed by former President Donald Trump. And to some extent, all countries know. By maximizing exports and minimizing imports, mercantilism is also viewed as a form of economic protectionism. And we do see economic protectionism, especially now with the war in Ukraine, where I was watching a report on CNN, and now countries are restricting the exports, and they're also restricting imports because they're trying to protect their own markets because of the instability at the global level. So the history of mercantilism, it began in the 16th century, in 16th century Europe, with the emergence of the nation state. So originally, there was this kind of feudal kind of way of how people live their lives. But with the concept of nation state, now there are no borders. So you now have national borders. So land masses were being carved out, quote unquote, to form nation state. So think about Jamaica, which is different from the United States, which is different from Canada. So you now have, these are actual nation states. And when you have nation states, then they actually have resources, they have land and they have people, and they have to ensure that they are able to produce and provide for their citizenry. All right. So the dominant economic theory was that the global supply of wealth was finite, and it was in the nation's best interest to accumulate as much as possible. During that time, wealth was measured by a country's quantity of silver and gold. And I'm sure when you watch some of those, what we call old time Christian shows or Jesus shows, you'll see that wealth was, there was an obsession with silver, there was an obsession with gold. All right. There is, and I'm sure anybody has ever watched the movie Leprechaun? Anybody has ever watched Leprechaun? Am I that old?
Yes, sir.
Never seen Leprechaun? There's an obsession in Leprechaun with gold. He's like, give me my gold. You need to go and watch it. It's a 1993 film. Are you guys younger than 1993? I'm sure I'm not that old. You guys make me seem old. So, and in Leprechaun, there's an obsession with gold. So during the mercantilist era, there was an obsession with wealth being measured by the amount of gold and silver. So what countries did was to really focus on maximizing their exports and minimizing imports. And this was especially with Britain, which resulted in a favorable balance of trade. In other words, these countries used mercantilism as a way to reduce imports and increase exports. All right. So for countries with a negative balance, trade balance with a mercantilist country, the difference would be paid back in silver or gold. So to maintain a favorable trade balance, the early mercantilist countries would enact imperialist policies by setting up colonies in smaller nations. So mercantilism as a theory also helps us to understand the transatlantic slave trade and how that was important, because part of what was being used, they were using people and colonies, not only Black, and I say peoples deliberately, were colonized. So you had Indians were colonized. You have different countries that actually were colonies of the let's say of different countries in Europe. Even the US was a colony of the of Britain. And what they really did was to use the colonies to ensure that they could maximize their profits. So all the wealth that was being created, the wealth was really to increase the wealth that was being created was really sent back to the motherland to ensure that those countries remain, quote unquote, affluent. So the main aim of mercantilism was to extract raw material to send back to the home country, where it would be refined into manufactured goods. Then these goods would then be resold to the colonies, allowing early mercantilist nations to accumulate wealth through a positive trade balance. So think about the balance of trade. Again, it goes back to the notion of increasing or maximizing exports and minimizing imports. So the ideology now, as an economic theory, mercantilism relies on government intervention to regulate international trade and to protect domestic industries. The interesting thing about mercantilist ideology is that it can actually help us to understand Michael Manley's economic policies during the 1970s, where there was a kind of protectionist approach where almost all the important, yes?
You're not sharing screen, right?
I am. You're not seeing?
No, sir. Not seeing anything.
Okay. Well, the good thing you were hearing, so I thought you guys were seeing screen, sorry. I'm not sharing screen. All right, so I was making the point that you can actually use mercantilism as a way as well to understand the economic approach or the economic policies or the economic ideology that informed Michael Manley's government of the 1970s, where there was government intervened a lot in the private sector and kind of nationalized many of the industries. Jamaica did that. That to some extent still happens now in Cuba, because that still have a kind of mercantilism can help us to some extent understand communism. Communism is about keeping the wealth in the country and limiting the imports of other goods and services. So it can help us to some extent understand communism in Cuba, the 1970s democratic socialism of Michael Manley, even the democratic socialist approach of the People's National Party. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Labourite, because I am a Labourite, but it does help us to understand the ideology that informs some of the approaches of different governments in terms of economic policy. So mercantilism policies involve the protection of domestic corporations through regulations and the promotion of trade surpluses. And again, I go back to part of what Trump, that speech by Trump. I don't know if I can get to play it. Probably that would help you to give you some context. But what he was saying is that, let me just see if I can find it. I think I played it for you guys before, but Trump and NAFTA. I think I've played it before, but let's just listen and hear and see to some extent if we can see that there's a kind of neo-mercantilist approach, or you hear echoes of mercantilism in this actual speech by former President Trump.
You haven't done it in 30 years or 26 years.
Well,
any number you
I've
want to
been
do.
a senator,
You
Donald,
haven't done it.
And
you haven't
I
done
have
it.
been a
And
Secretary of State, and I have
Your
done
husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, you go anywhere you want, Secretary Clinton, and you will see devastation where manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country. And now you want to approve Trans-Pacific Partnership. You were totally in favor of it. Then you heard what I was saying, how bad it is, and you said, I can't win that debate. But you know that if you did win, you would approve that, and that will be almost as bad as NAFTA. Nothing will ever top NAFTA.
That is just not accurate. I was against it once it was finally negotiated and the terms were laid out. I wrote about that in...
You called it the gold standard.
Well, I hope...
You called it the gold standard of trade deals. You said it's the final...
All right, so that's one. I don't want to play too much of it because what happens is that they usually have copyright restrictions. There's another one that is much shorter that we can get. It was like 2 or 1 minute. Yes, here it is. Let me just share screen quickly. So please listen, because I'm going to ask you if there's a relation, if can we use mercantilism to actually understand the sentiments being expressed by the former president. Please listen.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. This will be, she called it the gold standard. This will be a disaster. We're going to renegotiate NAFTA. Probably the worst trade deal ever agreed to, signed in the history of the world. We're also going to lower taxes on American business from 35% to 15%, and we will have the largest regulatory reform in American history. We're going to stand up to China. If we don't get the deal we want, we will withdraw from NAFTA and start all over and get a much, much better deal than we ever had before. And then they say I'm against trade. Well, I'm against deals like that, I can tell you.
All right. Anybody wants to respond now in terms of how mercantilism can be used to kind of understand the sentiments being expressed or the concerns being expressed about NAFTA or the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Don't all rush to answer me. And I'll call names if you take too long. So talk to me, guys. Nobody is able to explain. Rashid, what about you? What do you think? What are your thoughts? Kemar, what are your thoughts?
Sure, I'm gonna try to look through it still. Because Trump is against NAFTA because NAFTA is creating more harm than good, according to what he's saying. While Hillary, she was in agreement with the NAFTA.
According to him, you don't know that to be true. According to him, so be careful of how you phrase that. If you write that in a paper, I'll mark it out. I'll be very careful. That's what he's accusing her of, but you have to have independent evidence or corroborated evidence to make such a claim.
Yes, according to what Mr. Donald Trump is saying, that Hillary, she see this NAFTA as a goal idea versus the mercantilism ideology, which I'm actually trying to compare both of them, because this part, it says mercantilist policies involve the protection of domestic corporations through regulation and promotion of trade surpluses.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that NAFTA wasn't bringing an A game according to what former President Trump had just said.
Okay.
They would want more of the American citizens to benefit more from trade between countries.
All right, from international trade. That's what you just said.
Yeah,
international trade. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Jerome, your thoughts? Is there a way for us to use mercantilism to explain or understand the concerns expressed?
Not sure, no, sir. No, if I could have shed a little more light on it.
Okay, all right. Let's hear from Javar. Javar, your thoughts?
So, let's see if I can try to make a little sense. Well, with the video that was just played, former President Trump was stating that NAFTA was like the worst trading deal that was ever signed, and it led to like certain issues, like for example, persons losing their job or something like that. And we can't even really explain this words. So
Do we understand mercantilism? Do we understand the theory? Do we understand this theory?
Sir, not quite, sir. Because I actually came in it, so I don't really get it that much.
Okay. Anybody else? Is it that you guys don't understand mercantilism?
The 100%.
Sir.
100%.
Okay, so remember I said to you, and I think this, we had said that mercantilism, I think at the very beginning, I said mercantilism is an economic theory that emphasizes self-sufficiency through a favorable balance of trade. And I said to you that when we're talking about, when it says self-sufficiency, it means that a country is able to survive on its own, right? And balance of trade, when we're talking about balance of trade, we're saying that a country has a favorable balance of trade when it exports more than it imports. And mercantilist policies, therefore, was focused on wealth creation. And how it did that is that it maximized its exports and minimized its imports. And as a result, it is seen as a kind of economic protectionist fiscal approach. That means when it says protectionist approach, in other words, the country is going to do every and anything to maximize exports and to minimize imports. So it might increase tariffs and quotas on anything coming into the country. It might reduce, for example, the tax, business tax for companies so that they are able to compete competitively and maximize their productivity or their output in order to export to other countries. Do we understand that?
Yes, sir.
So when it says, for example, now that this is just talking about the fact that it came about in the 16th century, and that it was part of the way it gave rise to the notion of the nation state, and nation states at the time thought that they must accumulate wealth in order to survive. All right. And then now we got into the discussion about mercantilism in terms of it being linked to colonialism, and how the colonies were used as a way to ensure that certain countries, especially in Europe, were able to maximize their exports and minimize their imports. And here now, when I talk about mercantilist ideology in relation to international trade, what they're saying is that mercantilism relies on government intervention to regulate international trade and protect domestic industries. By that I mean, and I gave you the example of Michael Manley's approach in the 1970s, as well as it can help us to understand communism, where there is a way where governments they take ownership of many of they intervene a lot in the private sector. They have a lot of regulations in place, and they don't necessarily fully embrace free trade. So the private sector, it gives the private sector a very hard time, right? And in terms of international trade, it means as well that it would increase, for example, quotas as well as tariffs on goods coming into a country. And that is exactly what Trump is saying in the clipping. What Trump is saying is that we probably need to revisit how we look at international trade in the context of it not benefiting ordinary Americans. So he's saying that why should we sign agreements such as NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership when those particular types of international or trade agreements put cause, for example, more imports into the United States than exports, or it is really the balance of trade is in the negative because America is importing more than exporting. And as a result, for example, the local market, the local companies are not able to compete. And also he's also saying that there's far too much government regulation preventing the private sector being able to maximize output to compete with other players locally as well as internationally. Do we understand that now?
Okay, sir.
Yes, sir.
So when it says mercantilist policies involve the protection of domestic corporations, that's exactly what Trump says. He says, for example, we need to lower taxes on American businesses, we need to reform regulations, and we need to revisit NAFTA. That's exactly what he's saying. In other words, in order for us to have trade surpluses, we need to revisit what we're doing when we sign these regional agreements, because these regional agreements are not benefiting the country. So in the context of international trade, a favorable trade balance is achieved through government regulations such as tariffs and restrictions on imports. And I made that point earlier. So the mercantilist ideology in terms of a domestic, in terms of a, if you want to use the theory or the ideology to understand it in terms of a domestic market, you're looking at monopolies, right? So in other words, it allows the accumulation of capital and most times allows companies to kind of just buy out other companies to kind of take over. And in other words, the strongest survive, those who can't survive, you just, go to the wind. So such policies are a form of economic protectionism meant to encourage self-sufficiency and are in direct opposition to free market economics of trade and balance. Free market means that you have other players. You don't have monopolies. That's what free market means. You don't want to have one dominant player. You want to have many players so that there's you actually have competition. At the international level now, mercantilism, or if you want to use mercantilism to kind of understand present day international trade and the issues that are happening between, for example, the United States and China, what is happening in Russia. So Russia invades Ukraine. As a result, there's this big problem in terms of international trade because some countries now are limiting their exports. There's kind of a reverse. They're limiting their exports, right? They're limiting their exports, and to some extent, it's a reverse. They're actually some of them are increasing their imports because they don't have certain goods and services, and then the theories that will help us to understand that part now, we're talking about, for example, comparative advantage or absolute advantage within the context of what is currently happening. So present day mercantilism, let's just watch this audio first and then we can have a discussion. Let's just discuss mercantilism in terms of present day. What, I copy? I usually can't copy. It's very strange. I can no copy.
At the United Nations Security Council today, the U.S. accused Russia of using food as a weapon in its war against Ukraine, and in turn creating a global food security crisis. Ukraine grows enough food to feed 400 million people, and Ukraine and Russia together...
Let me not play this too long, because what I don't want is for them to block. They're going to put a lot of copyright restrictions, and I want you guys to be able to actually watch the recording. So although mercantilism is widely viewed as an outdated economic theory, there has been an emergence of mercantilist policies in recent times. Present-day mercantilism typically refers to protectionist policies that restricts imports to support domestic industries. It sometimes can be referred to as neo-mercantilism. And another way of how governments, and I'm not reading, this is just talking off the top of my head. Another way of how governments are using or doing protectionist policies is that they use subsidies. They subsidize their markets. For example, farming, their agricultural sector, they subsidize it, so they give them a lot of tax incentives or tax waivers where they don't have to pay a lot of taxes, or they actually fund some of the investment or give them a lot of loans. Sometimes the loans are at zero interest rate. so that they're able to produce as much and be able to export as much and compete globally. So modern mercantilist policies include tariffs on imports, which is and I'd given you the example before of what Trump did with both Canada and Mexico. Subsidizing domestic industries, which is what I was just talking about, when governments are actually helping key industries such as farming. Devaluation of currencies, this is China, and restrictions on the migration of foreign labor. This is partly why the UK, Britain came out of Brexit, because they wanted to restrict the movement of labor. They felt that too many Europeans were entering Britain and taking away, at least this is a sentiment that was being expressed by the citizenry, and the country decided, or the countries, the United Kingdom, made up of 3 countries, decided to come out of the European Union. All right, so we see modern day examples of mercantilism. So mercantilist policies can also explain the recent escalation of tariffs and trade restrictions between the US and China. So there is a way of how this particular theory can help us to understand not just historical international trade, but also 21st century international trade. The important thing for you to understand is you can't just, for example, write a paper for me and you're just, oh, mercantilism is this, mercantilism is that. You have to show your understanding of linking the theory or using the theory to either describe international trade or prescribe or talk about what some countries have used the theory to do in terms of prescriptions. So economic liberalization is more a prescriptive theory that speaks about free market, lower government taxes, reducing tariffs, and things like that. All right. So it's very important that you understand how to use the theory to talk in very intimate way about international trade historically and contemporarily. So balance of trade now. So we have been talking about balance of trade. So let's now get an understanding of balance of trade. So the difference between the monetary value of a country's imports and exports over a certain time period. In other words, that is the balance of trade. So how the difference, in other words, minus the imports, minus imports from exports, and that will tell you your balance of trade. The balance of trade or trade balance refers to the difference between the monetary value of a country's imports and exports over a period of time. A positive trade balance indicates a trade surplus, while a negative trade balance indicates a trade deficit. And as again, it goes back to what part of what Donald Trump was talking about. And actually, the United States does have a trade deficit with China. So the balance of trade is an important component in determining a country's current account. So here's the formula. Balance of trade equal value of exports minus value of imports, where the value of exports is the value of goods and services that are sold to buyers in other countries, and the value of imports is the value of goods and services that are bought from sellers in other countries. A positive balance occurs when exports are greater than imports and is referred to as a trade surplus, and a negative trade balance occurs when exports are less than imports and is referred to as a trade deficit. Any questions? Any questions? Are we understanding, or do we understand?
So far, I guess. So far.
Yes.
Okay. Interpreting a balance of trade. So a balance of trade refers to the difference between a country's exports and imports. The trade figure alone does not provide much insight into the actual health of an economy. The US is an example of a country with a long-standing trade deficit, but that is currently experiencing one of its largest expansions in history. So it could be, for example, it doesn't point to things like foreign direct investments, right? A positive balance of trade does not necessarily indicate a healthy economy, nor does a negative one necessarily indicate a weak economy. So the United States, again, go back to that example, it has a negative balance of trade, but the economy itself is not weak. All right. And again, I go back to the example now that I'd used in a previous lecture to kind of bring things home, right? So here is Donald Trump. This is one of his tweets. This is from 2018. He says, tariffs are the greatest. Either a country which has treated the United States unfairly on trade negotiations, a fair deal, or it gets hit with tariffs. It's as simple as that. And everybody's talking. Remember, we are the piggy bank that's being robbed. All will be great. All right. So what he's actually getting at now is that he's trying to ensure that there's a trade surplus, not a trade deficit. In his mind, once there is a trade deficit, then of course the economy is weak, or it appears as such. So, and if you look here, you see, for example, that tariffs imposed in 2018 versus tariffs threatened by Trump, which is far more. And if you look at it, there is a trade deficit between the United States, right? So China from the US, so Chinese tariffs on the US, 110 billion. So total US goods imported into China, 120 billion. So in other words, there are far more goods, Chinese goods going into the United States than is going into China. And in his mind, that's not fair. We need to revisit these negotiations. We need to revisit these agreements that we have signed in terms of international trade. And part of why we need to revisit it, or if United States wants a trade surplus, it needs to lower taxes on American businesses, reform regulations. In other words, you have too much government regulation standing in the way of allowing the private sector to compete domestically and internationally. And we also need to reform NAFTA, and that's exactly what he did by forming the US, Canada, and Mexico agreement. So part of the tools of mercantilism are tariffs and quotas. So we did talk about tariff being a tax on goods that are coming into a country. And as a result, it makes the local goods cheaper than the imported ones. And quota in terms of you put a cap on the number of goods that are coming into a particular country. All right. And even though, and now you're actually finding that a lot of countries now are also putting quotas on there. As I said before, there's a kind of reverse now happening with some countries, because they now want to limit what they're exporting and actually increase what they're importing, because there's a shortage of, for example, oil. There's a shortage of food in many countries. All right. So you have to be able to use the theory, mercantilism, and this is just one of the many theories that we'll explore to explain international trade in a very intimate way. It's not I don't want a regurgitation of what the trade theory is. That is important and giving me some amount of history. But if you cannot use it, for example, to talk about things like supply chain, globalization, then of course you're not demonstrating the actual skill that you need to learn in the course. So a summary of mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic theory that emphasizes self-sufficiency through a favorable balance of trade. It's an economic policy that rely on government intervention to restrict imports and protect domestic industries. And modern-day mercantilist policies include tariffs, subsidizing domestic industries, devaluation of currencies, and restrictions on migration of foreign labor. Can you think of any other modern-day mercantilist policies outside of tariffs, subsidizing domestic industries, devaluing currency, and restrictions on the migration of labor? Can you think of any other mercantilist, modern-day mercantilist policies? That are not listed here in this Hello. Can anybody think of any other modern day mercantilist policies?
So I'm thinking, sir, but nothing is not coming to my brain as it relates to that. Those are basically the main ones, sir.
Yes,
Major ones.
but I mentioned some others, so I thought you guys would have
Uh-huh.
would be able to tell me. There are two others that I mentioned. Actually, they were mentioned by former President Donald Trump. Nothing from Javar, Jerome, Kemar, Rashid.
No, sir. Can't think of none.
Sir,
Yes.
what about tax reduction?
Tax production or tax reduction.
Reduction.
So explain it to us. Let's see how you how it becomes a kind of modern day mercantilist policy.
So this will encourage more persons to become business owners, right? Because in some cases where person would outsource, like for example, businesses in Jamaica, maybe we'll go to China to outsource their labor because it is cheaper there. So the taxes may be cheaper there versus in Jamaica. So if them get a tax reduction, in that case, it would maybe give them a bit more. That's no. It's like encourage them to stay instead of going to a next country to start a business to develop a next country economy.
Okay, all right. You're thinking. Yeah. So you hit the nail on the head. Lowering taxes on businesses in your country so that they are able to produce and compete globally and increase their productivity. Right. That's very, very important. The other thing too is to reform regulations, ensure that the regulations that are in place are not stifling the private sector from operating in a particular way, and that the regulations are there to really help domestic companies to compete globally and increase their output. And another thing too, I would add, is to really critically evaluate regional agreements or audit the regional agreements that exist now, and to see whether or not they are really protecting and or benefiting a country as it relates to international trade. All right. Any questions about mercantilism? Any questions?
No, looks so, sir.
All right. So the other theory now we move on to is absolute advantage. So by the end of the 18th century, scholars such as Adam Smith and David Hume began to evaluate and critique the merits of mercantilism theory. Contrary to established beliefs, the scholars realized that wealth was not finite, but could be created through the productive allocation of labor. So mercantilist policies also fail to account for the benefits of trade, such as comparative advantage and economies of scale. When countries specialize in the production of goods for which they enjoy a comparative advantage, so specialization now is important, is becoming a big part of the conversation now. Trade can result in mutually beneficial deals. Such a realization resulted in the emergence of market economy, where prices and means of production were driven by the forces of supply and demand. So we see now that as we are moving slowly away from the mercantilist protectionist approach to now opening up of economies where a kind of neoliberal, not necessarily liberalism in its broadest sense or in the perfect sense, but now we're seeing where there's a suggestion that instead of being protectionist and just want to export to everybody else and want to limit what comes into your own country, probably now we need to revisit that concept and look at specialization. What do we mean by specialization? Specialization means that you're going to produce the goods that you are able to produce using the least resources and export those, and allow other countries to specialize in goods that they're able to produce better using the least resources. So there's a benefit to both parties. So I buy the goods from you that you're better able to produce than myself, and you will do the same. I can produce coconut better than mango, so I export coconut you are able to better produce mango. I buy your mango, you buy my coconut. So again, no, there is a way, there is hope, or there's a room for international trade, for countries to kind of work together or to trade goods, because at this time they're really trading goods because it's the 18th century, not services. So theory of absolute advantage. Adam Smith argued that a country has an absolute advantage in the production of a product when it is more efficient than any other country in producing it and enhance global efficiency through participation in free trade. Absolute advantage is the ability of an individual, company, region, or country to produce a greater quantity of a good or service with the same quantity of inputs per unit of time, or to produce the same quantity of good or service per unit of time using a lesser quantity of inputs than its competitors. What does all of that mean? So absolute advantage can be accomplished by creating the good or service at a lower absolute cost per unit, using a smaller number of inputs, or by a mere efficient process. What do we mean by that? So when it says a lower absolute cost per unit, we're talking about the total expenditure incurred by a company to produce, store, or sell 1 unit of a particular product or service. In other words, so they are able to do it cheaper, right? It could be that the cheaper might be as a result of labor. It could be as a result of the kinds of resources that are in a country. All right. So the term efficiency refers to the peak level of performance that uses the least amount of inputs to achieve the highest amount of output. So what does all of this mean? Can you just tell me if you understand when we're talking about absolute advantage, what exactly this theory is describing in relation to international trade?
Sorry, sir. What was the question I asked, sir?
In other words, tell me what you understand from, what do you understand about absolute advantage in relation to international trade? I can go back here if that helps you.
Sir,
Yes.
I think when it comes on to absolute advantage is that countries are able to produce a larger amount of outputs in whatever they are producing.
Yeah, something like that. In other words, if you have 2 countries and one country has the absolute advantage in terms of producing water, because as it says, they're able to do this because it costs them less, or they're able to do it using the least amount of inputs, then of course they have absolute advantage in terms of producing water. And if another country has another absolute advantage, let's just say in terms of producing milk, then they have an absolute advantage. So the theory is saying that because country A has an absolute advantage in producing water and country B has an absolute advantage in producing milk, they should trade. They should trade between the countries.
Sir,
yes.
Next, I think when you read about CARICOM, within the Caribbean countries, that was one of the points that I must say jump out on me now, because within Caribbean countries, for example, we produce banana and then produce planted, with the limited restriction as CARICOM countries, we are better able to have an absolute advantage. Basically, it's like me, I give you more banana, you give me more planting. So we are better able to balance, in that sense, at a very competitive cost.
Yes, to some extent. And you can look at it also in the context that probably why there are regional agreements is that countries are seeking to have absolute advantage. So when we combine together, we have an absolute advantage in terms of producing this one thing. So you can think about it two ways. Does that, I hope I'm making sense in terms of what I just said. So you mentioned that countries in the region, they probably trade with each other, form the Caribbean single market economy because some of the countries have absolute advantage in producing a certain good, whether it be banana or another country, it could be potato or whatever it is. And as a result, it makes sense for them to form the regional agreement and just trade between and among themselves. So in that case, you can look at it that way. And I was saying too, also another way you can think about it is that countries that probably singularly don't have any sort of absolute advantage form these regional blocks, because when they form the regional blocks, or let us say the Caribbean single market economy, it then has an absolute advantage in producing a particular thing, whether it can do it at a lower cost per unit, or it can do it using getting the most using the least, by inputting the least. All right, so that's another way for you can look at absolute advantage. Do you see any weaknesses though, or any concerns, any weaknesses in terms of absolute advantage based on what they are recommending or describing in terms of international trade?
I think to some extent there are some advantages.
I said disadvantages, not advantage.
Oh, disadvantages.
Yes. Can you think of any disadvantage?
I am looking at it maybe from the angle as a disadvantage, where we're going to use by the CARICOM countries because we have an absolute advantage of maybe potato and banana.
Exactly. What if the two countries have the absolute advantage?
But if the two
over the same good, so I have an absolute advantage over banana because I can produce it, and you have an absolute advantage over the potato as well. How does that work out in terms of international trade?
Well, sir.
So that's a big criticism of the theory.
Okay.
That some countries, and think about, let's just say you're thinking about absolute advantage in terms of a developed country and a developing country. So the theory is encouraging international trade, right? It's saying countries need to trade between and among themselves because every country has an absolute advantage. But absolute advantage can become relative because some countries have an absolute advantage because they are far more developed, they have the latest technology and all of that. So where would smaller countries have an absolute, in which area would a country like Jamaica have an absolute advantage, or even the Caribbean? Where exactly would we have an absolute advantage in terms of international trade? Yes, somebody said, sir, go ahead.
Just that listen to the way that's a based on the absolute advantage. So by the looks of it, yeah, basically I say for instance, Jamaica will produce banana and them thing there, but you have other bigger nations that produce the same thing too. Or maybe to the disadvantage and the advantage to this is the climate that we have compared to some other countries. So them can't do nothing more than get those items from the Caribbean versus the disadvantage would be if another country can develop a strategy for create or put things in place we have that item where we have, then they would have beat we because they have more resources, more manpower and all of them things there. So that come like US source most of them things from China or so on and so forth.
Who was talking, Jerome?
Yes, sir.
Kudos, you are thinking. I love the fact that you're thinking, because you said something that I wasn't even thinking about. You said that probably our absolute advantage is the fact that we have sun. We can actually grow them naturally versus the United States. And it doesn't have to be the United States versus another country where they have to actually grow them in greenhouses.
Remember, everything I go come back down to a time zone and all of them things that it have to go back to science. When you look upon it, because I remember say when a summertime here, so as something different than our next place on the planet, you know. You understand me? I say, so this so the absolute advantage that come in and this that come into play. So like
Right.
overall the comparative advantage. So that's the difference coming in. So the comparative advantage would be, we already know that, but the absolute advantage that now boil down to who have the more time on them and you understand, or who have the better climate, who in the better season now would have boost absolute advantage as the time go by. So you would have like a country that produce better in the summer versus a country. If you understand me, I lead.
No, I understand what you're saying. I do understand
so
what you're saying.
I feel like absolute advantage have a little for play with the time and the season. Because I know say right through the year a country might be now produce a certain item. Say for instance, for example, grape. I know say in a summer alone them item they can really bear the most. But then again, you can have bigger nations. I remember right through the year we eat grape, sir. You understand what I say? And that's something where actually by right, as some might grow. If you take that and plant it at your house, the grapevine them go run, and you have to, you know what I mean, do certain things to make sure say by summer it a blossom and all of them things. The while a developed country now have strategy and enough people in the field, enough scientific research and all of them things that boost the for them economy with grapes right through the year. So this of them beat the local farmers them now, we are plant them local grape.
Or them beat the local farmers by way of being no, I'm actually just continuing what you're saying.
Add value to it, sir. That what mean.
No. You're making sense. You're making a lot of sense. You might not be using my language, but you're actually making a lot of sense in the fact that. But I was saying too that probably absolute advantage might come about in these other countries, not necessarily might come about because they are able to subsidize the industry itself.
And then use them resource properly to the full effect.
Yeah, they're more efficient, and that's where efficiency comes in.
More efficient, yes, sir.
They're more efficient at producing these things than other countries. But you do have some countries that have quote unquote absolute advantage. When you think about wine, when people want wine anywhere in the world, they think, where do we normally? When people, well, I don't know if you guys drink wine. I don't drink wine either. But I think wine. I think France is the place.
France and Italy and them place.
Right. So they would have an absolute advantage in terms
Rome and them place.
Right.
For a long time, they drink wine.
Exactly. But Jamaica would have an absolute advantage, and I don't think it exists anywhere else in the Caribbean in terms of Blue Mountain coffee.
Sugar cane.
Well, I don't know what sugar cane. Blue Mountain coffee, we would have an absolute advantage with that.
Yeah.
So it would make sense for, like, let's just say Italy. Let's just say the Italy or France, they
want them. I love coffee.
Yeah, we just trade.
Blue Mountain Peak.
Why not trade? We just trade because you want your coffee, and we want your wine. So might as well we trade. So
and then, sir, when I look on it from a longer time, the coffee our coffee has took its place on the market. It's something where people say, yeah, man, it nice. You know what I mean? So that add to it too,
Yeah, it's just like America has an absolute advantage over hip hop music.
Yes, sir. Take it to the culture and the music.
Yeah, if you really want to be a hip hop artist, most times, you have to go to the United States. Not in every single case, but if you think about the biggest hip hop artists, they are in the United States. So absolute advantage helps us to understand international trade in that context. And in terms of what makes you having an absolute advantage, there are natural things, or what are called natural advantages, or acquired advantages. And I think it was Jerome who was mentioning, for example, given climatic conditions, that might make you have an absolute advantage. Access to particular resources, the availability of labor. The absolute advantage might be in terms of in China, because they abuse the law in terms of child labor. The acquired advantage now, superior skills, better technology, greater capital assets, trained and an educated labor force. So you'll always find that some countries, whether it be absolute advantage or comparative advantage, when it comes on to train and educated labor force, they will always be ahead of some countries. So if you think about even a country like Canada, some of my friends describe Canada as an overeducated society or overeducated country because education is very affordable. The government funds education. There are so many things, systems in place to ensure that the country itself remains very competitive, that the labor force remains very educated and well skilled. They have an immigration system that works, that helps them at the end of the day become competitive international trade because they're taking the best of the best. They use it as a kind of streaming service or a kind of a filter, so they get the best of the best into the country. Persons who want to become, they're already doctors and lawyers and engineers and scientists. Okay, come to Canada, do a 8 months program, and then you join our labor force. You go and you work at these different places and you develop, or discover these different things, and you're able to export those kinds of things. So you have what are called natural and acquired advantages that give countries, whether it be comparative advantages or it gives them absolute advantages. So Smith's thinking, the concept of absolute advantage was developed by Adam Smith to show how countries can gain from trade by specializing in producing and exporting the goods that they can produce more efficiently than other countries. So it's important that when you're talking about absolute advantage and comparative advantage, that you use the term specialization. Very, very important that you use the term specialization. Countries with an absolute advantage can decide to specialize in producing and selling a specific good or service and use the generated funds to purchase goods and services from other countries. And I think an example, another example could be Germany with producing, I think they manufacture BMW, and Japan that makes the other, I can't remember, Toyota. So they kind of have absolute advantage in the different areas in that Japan is also a developed country and they have the per capita income, and persons from that country can buy the BMW and things like that. All right. What time is it? Understanding absolute advantage. Smith argued that specializing in the products that they each have an absolute advantage in and then trading the products can make all countries better off. Not necessarily true, but as long as they have each have at least one product for which they hold an absolute advantage over others. However, though, you know that some countries find ways around these absolute advantage. What do I mean by that? So I have an absolute advantage in terms of producing, let's just say ganja. Jamaica has, or we thought we had an absolute advantage in producing ganja. But let's say for argument's sake, Jamaica has an absolute advantage in terms of producing ganja. And, America has an interest in buying our ganja. Here, what can happen to reduce or dilute our absolute advantage? American private sector companies, they come through the back door, but at the hands of politicians, and what? Buy out the local owners or buy out the local market. So Jamaica no longer has an absolute advantage. Am I making sense? Do we understand that?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, man.
So far, yes, sir.
Yeah. So absolute advantage explains why it makes sense for individuals. Remember, I said that theories explain how or why something is done. So absolute advantage explains why it makes sense for individuals, businesses, and countries to trade with each other. Since each has advantages in producing certain goods and services, both entities can benefit from the exchange. And notice it says can benefit. So there's a possibility that one will benefit more than the other. And also too, the term benefit becomes relative because who specifically is benefiting? So the mutual gain from trade forms the basis of Smith's argument that specialization, the division of labor, and subsequent trade lead to an overall increase in prosperity from which all can benefit. This, Smith believed, was the root cause, source of the eponymous wealth of nation. In other words, this is how countries are going to become very rich, which is not true. Many countries have explored and they haven't become rich. Some of the countries that were rich originally from the beginning of time, they're still rich, and the countries that were poor from the beginning of time are still poor. I don't know if you know that before Haiti was a colony, Haiti was actually the richest country in the Caribbean. But of course, because of colonialism or the transatlantic slave trade and the fact that they gained their independence first, they are no, if not, I think they are the poorest country in the region, because when they gained their independence, they actually had to pay back France for all the destruction of property and things like that. All right, any questions?
No, sir.
No, sir, none from me.
Okay. All right, so
So
I'm
not
going
at the
to,
moment, sir.
okay, yes, I'm going to pause here, but I am going to bring back up the tutorial paper. Let me just see if I can find it. I had it here earlier. Oh, no, it was on, let me just go back on Canvas. Oh yes, here it is. So we're going to look, in the other class, we're going to look at comparative advantage and the other. So next week we have Javar, Williams, and Kemar. So it says examine the roles international bodies play in international trade. So remember now that we would love, for one, we want a PowerPoint presentation. It would be good to have a PowerPoint presentation, and that you vary the interaction. It must be between 5 to 10 minutes. You vary the interaction. So we don't want you to come here and just be reading from a slide, reading from a paper or anything like that. We want you to interact with us, give us a lot of information, because I will have questions, and I want, in other words, everybody should come prepared for the question as well. And please do not do the, I hope you guys don't choose the same international body. All right, and for this question, you can choose only two, whether you choose only two, even though it says international bodies and I didn't quantify it, but I just want you to choose only two. Don't go beyond two. The other thing I want to make mention of, I think you're still seeing, my screen, and I'll talk about it later, is turn it in. Are you still seeing my screen? I can't remember if everybody is here. Let me look at my students. Everybody's name is here. I have Ray, Rochelle, Matthew, Kemar, Kenya, Jerome, Javar. Is there anybody who's in the class whose name is not here?
My name is not there, sir.
What's your
Alright.
name? All right, so it's Alray. What's your last name again?
Osset.
Grosset?
Osset. Hussett.
Hussett.
Yes,
What's
sir.
your email? What's your student email?
Alray, full stop, Osset, 67 at my ECC.
Isn't it at my.ecc?
My, yes, sir. Yes, sir. My.ecc.edu.jm.
All right, so this is where you're going to submit your papers. The first assignment is your, so we did the in class. So this is the in class, it's there. Some persons didn't oh, you guys worked in pairs. So the other one, no, let me create the other assignment, will be the tutorial paper. So let me just create that in front of you.
Sir, remember the assignment that you did say, hold on.
No, you're going to do it. Once you do a presentation, then you upload your paper a week after.
Oh, yeah, but when I asked, sir, I said, wait for you.
No, you're not going to upload it now, but you're going to upload it once you have done your presentation. The one that you do tonight, you have until next week Sunday, because I'm going to show you how to structure the paper. It's very important that you structure the paper properly, because you will find out that I don't give away marks. You will have to earn it.
Yeah, but we did an in-class presentation the other day, sir.
No. I'm talking about a written paper.
Oh, you mean the one we had next week?
I mean the one that you're going to upload for your tutorial. So let me show you an example. Where am I? Let's go. I usually should be able to go. Oh yeah, home. So where's my other international? I think I've shown you this before. So my students, what they do, so they would present the week, they would present in 1 week, right? And then they have to upload the final paper. So Mario would have presented the week before and then upload his paper, and he got 7 out of 10. So this is the actual written paper now. He has an introduction and he has his body paragraphs. So I think descriptive trade theories and their impact on international trade. And he has his stuff here, kind of explaining a lot of things there. Notice that, well, it doesn't need to be this long. It's just that he is very, he was a strong student. So he understood what he was doing and was really, he just got heavily involved in the paper, in the course. So this is how you structure it. So what I'm going to do on Wednesday, I'm going to take some time out to show you how to structure your paper. This is for everybody, how you structure an academic paper, so that you can do it for both your tutorial paper as well as your research paper. So there will be some time for you to understand how to do that, because that part has to be done properly, because you're not going to plagiarize and I give you any grade. All right, you have to properly structure your paper. This is an academic institution. We're not running a party shop. So we do serious work here. No, we're not going to copy and paste and get good grades and get A's, at least not with Mr. Clark, not with me. So I'm going to show you how to structure the paper, and you will not fail the course, but I'm just telling you that you're going to properly do the work. So don't see that I'm trying to frighten anybody. I'm just telling you that you have to properly do the work. All right, any questions, comments, concerns before I say good night?
Yes, sir. It was a good class.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, so I take it everybody else is okay. All right, see you guys next week, okay? Enjoy your weekend, be safe. Be very, very safe. I see Jamaica is, every day they're killing somebody, so be very safe, gentlemen.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.